When you strip away the headlines and the sound bites, what you find is that tariffs, especially one as steep as 50%, are never just about the surface story. They are economic weapons, and like any weapon, they are chosen with purpose, precision, and intent. This move was not a simple matter of America punishing India for a specific grievance. It was the first note in a larger symphony of negotiation, leverage, and influence. You see, trade is not an abstract financial exercise. It's the bloodstream of a nation's economy, and when a government decides to slow or block that flow, it is essentially forcing the other side to stop, take notice, and reconsider the terms of engagement. Historically, tariffs have been the go-to instrument for nations seeking both protection and power. They protect domestic industries by making foreign goods more expensive, creating a safe haven for local producers. But they also function as psychological leverage, signaling to the other side, we hold the keys to your market access and we're willing to use them. In this case, the 50% tax was a loud message to India, but it was also a whisper to the rest of the world. The United States is not afraid to use hard economic barriers, even with partners it calls allies. Now, when you think about it, the choice of 50% was no accident. It's not just a figure pulled from a hat. It's a statement of scale. It's high enough to sting, high enough to dominate the headlines, and high enough to force businesses, investors, and governments to recalculate their strategies overnight. This is the art of economic theater, where the drama is as important as the numbers. The audience is global, and the message is meant to be remembered. From a psychological standpoint, the move leverages uncertainty. Economies thrive on predictability. Businesses need to know that the rules today will resemble the rules tomorrow. But by introducing sharp, unexpected changes, a leader can create just enough chaos to destabilize the other side's confidence. That's when negotiations can be steered in a desired direction. And let's be clear, uncertainty is not always a side effect. Sometimes it's the strategy itself. At its core, this tariff is not only an economic barrier but also a diplomatic chess move. It forces India to decide whether to resist and risk further escalation, or to engage and potentially make concessions in other trade or political arenas. It reframes the power dynamic, reminding both sides that in the modern world, economics is inseparable from diplomacy and diplomacy is inseparable from power. The danger, and the genius, of such a maneuver is that it doesn't end at the border. The ripple effects touch global supply chains, investor confidence, and even public sentiment in both countries. Every tariff is a signal, and every signal has an echo. The real question is not simply why it happened, but what it sets in motion, because in the realm of global trade, the first move is rarely the last. And in the game of economic power, hesitation is often more costly than confrontation. If we look closely, the 50% tariff was never just a spreadsheet calculation. It was a political performance, choreographed as carefully as any campaign rally. In the United States, trade policy is rarely shaped in isolation from domestic politics. It is deeply entangled with the narratives leaders tell their people, the image they want to project, and the promises they've made to those who put them in power. Donald Trump's America First doctrine wasn't merely an economic stance, it was a worldview. It reframed every deal, every handshake, and every international negotiation as a test of whether America was winning or losing. In that context, slapping India with a massive import tax was more than an economic maneuver. It was a message to the American heartland that their jobs, their factories, their industries were being defended with iron walls. It fed into the perception that the global economy had been unfair to American workers, that trade deals had drained manufacturing towns of their livelihoods, and that someone was finally willing to fight back. The logic here wasn't just about revenue from imports, it was about loyalty from voters. From a political psychology perspective, leaders understand that economic policies are often judged not by their technical outcomes, but by the emotional resonance they create. A factory worker in Ohio doesn't analyze the tariff's impact on bilateral trade volumes. He hears that foreign goods are now more expensive, and he feels that his government is standing up for him. That feeling can be far more powerful than any economic graph. This is where politics transforms economics into a narrative weapon. And then there's the deeper layer. India's growing economic confidence was starting to unsettle the traditional U.S. perception of itself as the uncontested center of economic gravity. In the political theater, optics matter as much as substance. By imposing the tariff, Trump positioned himself not just as a negotiator, but as a defender against a rising competitor. It played into a broader script, one where America reasserts dominance in a world it believes is tilting away from its favor. Of course, this kind of policy is not without risk. Political theatrics can generate real-world consequences, strained alliances, retaliatory measures, lost opportunities for cooperation. But in the heat of domestic politics, long-term consequences often take a backseat to short-term political capital. The 50% tariff wasn't simply a bargaining chip, it was also a rallying cry. And rallying cries are rarely subtle. They are designed to echo in headlines, fuel debates, and keep a leader's image firmly in the spotlight. The truth is, in politics, perception often outruns reality. A tariff like this can be spun as an act of strength, even if the economic results are mixed. And therein lies the genius and danger of political messaging. It can turn a complex economic instrument into a symbol of identity and resolve. Because in the end, people don't just vote for policies, they vote for the story they believe those policies tell. And stories, once believed, can be harder to dismantle than any trade barrier. India's rise over the last 2 decades has been nothing short of remarkable. Once viewed primarily as a developing market, it has steadily transformed into a formidable economic force, with a growing manufacturing base, a booming tech sector, and an expanding middle class that is reshaping global consumption patterns. This transformation has not gone unnoticed in Washington. In fact, it's precisely this rapid ascent that has shifted the tone of U.S.-India economic relations from one of straightforward cooperation to one tinged with competitive tension. For decades, the United States held an unchallenged position in many sectors of the global economy. Even when other nations grew, they often did so within a framework largely shaped by American influence, economically, politically, and culturally. But India's rise carries a different energy. It's not just about economic growth, it's about self-reliance. India is investing heavily in domestic manufacturing, energy independence, and technological infrastructure. It is not merely integrating into existing global systems, it is beginning to rewrite the rules to suit its own long-term interests. This naturally changes the psychological equation. In geopolitics, rising powers create unease not just because they produce more goods or generate more wealth, but because they introduce unpredictability into the established order. For the U.S., India's increasing ability to say no to unfavorable terms and to actively pursue trade deals that bypass American dominance signals a shift in leverage. It challenges the unspoken assumption that emerging economies will always play by rules set elsewhere. From America's perspective, the 50% tariff was partly about sending a warning shot, a reminder that access to the U.S. market is not unconditional. It was also about slowing the momentum of a competitor before that competitor's position becomes too entrenched to challenge. While India remains a strategic partner in many areas, its growing independence in economic and diplomatic decision-making means it cannot be relied upon to align with U.S. priorities at all times. There's also the matter of pride. Nations, like individuals, operate with a sense of identity, and India's current trajectory feeds into a renewed sense of historical destiny. After centuries of colonial exploitation and decades of economic constraints, India's leadership and people view their rise not as a lucky break, but as a restoration of rightful status. In that mindset, concessions are seen not as pragmatic compromises, but as betrayals of national progress. And so, the clash becomes inevitable, not necessarily as an outright conflict, but as a test of boundaries. How much independence can India assert before the United States pushes back? How much pressure can the U.S. apply without undermining a strategic relationship it still values in other arenas? The 50% tariff was one answer to that question, but it was far from the last. The deeper truth here is that power, once distributed, is rarely given back willingly, and when two nations see themselves as rightful leaders in the global economy, every deal, every tariff, every negotiation becomes more than an economic transaction. It becomes a statement of identity. When people hear the word tariff, they often imagine it as a single, isolated action, a tax on imported goods, a straightforward economic barrier. But in reality, tariffs are rarely standalone decisions. They are usually one piece of a much larger negotiation puzzle, a lever pulled to influence outcomes far beyond the product in question. The 50% import tax on India was not just about the goods it targeted, it was a move designed to alter the broader balance of trade talks, and by extension, the political relationship between the two countries. Think of it like a chess match. In chess, not every move is aimed at taking a piece immediately. Some moves are strategic positioning, forcing your opponent to shift, opening up vulnerabilities, and creating opportunities for a decisive strike later on. In trade, the same principle applies. A large, attention-grabbing tariff can be the opening gambit to push the other side toward concessions in entirely different areas. It might be aimed at getting better terms for U.S. agricultural exports, at nudging India toward more favorable technology import policies, or even at securing alignment on unrelated geopolitical issues like defense cooperation or energy partnerships. what makes this tactic effective is the way it compresses timelines. Without pressure, trade negotiations can drag on for years, with each side reluctant to make the first compromise. By introducing a sudden costly tariff, the U.S. essentially disrupted the rhythm, making inaction more expensive for India. This is negotiation by disruption, a strategy that forces the other side to act simply because standing still becomes unbearable. But there's another, less visible dimension to this: the signaling effect. Tariffs are rarely aimed only at the country they directly affect. Other nations are always watching, taking notes, and recalculating their own positions. By hitting India with such a steep import tax, the U.S. was also sending a message to the rest of the world: if we're willing to do this to a partner, imagine what we might do to a rival. That kind of signaling can shape trade talks with multiple nations simultaneously, creating a ripple effect that extends far beyond the original dispute. Of course, this kind of brinkmanship carries risks. Push too hard, and the other side may dig in rather than bend. The line between productive pressure and permanent damage to a relationship is thin, and both nations know it. But in high-stakes economic diplomacy, risk is part of the calculation. Every move is weighed not only for its immediate impact, but for its potential to alter the negotiation landscape in the months or years ahead. In the end, this 50% tariff was not simply about protecting American producers or punishing Indian exporters. It was about reshaping the conversation entirely. It was a reminder that in the world of global trade, the most visible moves are often the least literal. Because sometimes, the product on the table isn't the real prize is the position it puts you in for the next deal. A tariff of this magnitude does not exist in a vacuum. The moment the United States imposed a 50% import tax on Indian goods, the ripple effects began spreading far beyond the two countries directly involved. In today's interconnected global economy, a trade dispute between two major players becomes a signal event, influencing not just bilateral relations, but the strategies of governments, corporations, and financial markets around the world. The first and most obvious ripple is in the recalibration of alliances. Trade relationships are rarely just about economics, they are deeply political. When the U.S. takes a hard line against India, other nations pay attention and adjust their positions accordingly. China, for example, may see an opportunity to strengthen its economic ties with India, offering alternative markets or favorable trade terms in order to pull New Delhi further into its orbit. The European Union, always watchful for openings in global markets, might step in to negotiate deals with India that the U.S. is now jeopardizing. In this way, what began as a bilateral tension can quickly reshape the global trade map. Then there's the subtle yet significant shift in perception. Nations are constantly gauging not just each other's policies, but their willingness to follow through on threats. The U.S. striking India with such a steep tariff sends a clear message: Washington is willing to play hardball, even with partners it has publicly praised in other contexts. For allies, this can be a cautionary tale. Partnership with America comes with potential volatility. For rivals, it can be a reminder that unpredictability is part of the American playbook. But the ripple effects don't stop at the level of governments. Global corporations, those with supply chains spanning continents, must now reassess their strategies. A U.S. tariff on India doesn't just affect exporters, it impacts multinational companies sourcing parts, materials, or services from Indian firms. Some may relocate production to avoid the new costs, others may shift their focus toward markets less likely to be caught in trade crossfire. These corporate adjustments, in turn, can alter the economic landscape within both countries, affecting jobs, investments, and growth trajectories. There is also the long-term psychological impact on global trade norms. Every time a major economy imposes a high-profile, aggressive tariff, it erodes the sense of stability that underpins free trade agreements. If nations begin to view tariffs not as rare, last resort measures but as routine negotiation tactics, the entire system risks sliding toward a more fragmented, protectionist world order. And in such an environment, trust, once lost, becomes incredibly difficult to rebuild. So while the 50% tariff was aimed squarely at India, its echoes are heard everywhere. In the modern global economy, no action is truly isolated. Every move changes the game board. And that is the real challenge of wielding economic power. It may win you a battle, but it also redraws the map on which the next battles will be fought. Beneath the layers of economics and politics, there's an even more fundamental reality at play here. Tariffs are about power, and power is as much about perception as it is about capability. A 50% import tax is not only a financial barrier, it's a statement. It tells the world, we have the will to act decisively, and we expect you to adjust. In geopolitics, these statements are as important as the actual outcomes they produce, because every nation operates not just on hard data, but on the stories it tells itself about who is strong, who is weak, and who sets the rules. This is where psychology becomes inseparable from policy. Nations, like individuals, are influenced by signaling. When a country makes a bold move, especially one that appears costly or risky, it shifts the mental framework through which others view it. For the United States, imposing such a steep tariff on India was not only about protecting certain industries or forcing a specific negotiation outcome, it was also about reinforcing the image of a leader willing to take bold, even confrontational stances in defense of its interests. In a sense, it was as much a performance for the global stage as it was a bilateral trade measure. The impact of this kind of signaling is twofold. Domestically, it projects strength, feeding into the narrative that leadership is active, decisive, and unafraid to challenge others, even allies, when American interests are at stake. Internationally, it creates an environment of calculated uncertainty. If partners and rivals alike know that the U.S. is willing to deploy heavy economic measures without hesitation, they are forced to approach every negotiation with greater caution. This, in turn, can shift the balance of leverage before talks even begin. But there's a philosophical cost here as well. When power is projected primarily through confrontation, relationships, even beneficial ones, can become defined by suspicion. Over time, trust erodes, and with it, the willingness to engage in the kind of cooperative ventures that generate mutual growth. That's the paradox. The same action that asserts dominance in the short term can make partnership more difficult in the long term. And yet, leaders still make these moves because the perception of strength often pays immediate political dividends. The 50% tariff, then, wasn't simply a trade policy, it was a symbolic line in the sand. It was a demonstration of how economic tools can be used not just to shape markets, but to shape narratives, and through those narratives, to shape the global order itself. That is why it matters. Because in the end, every bold act in international politics is a kind of language, and the question is whether that language builds bridges or builds walls. And that's the truth we can't ignore in the theater of global power. Perception often decides the outcome long before the actual game is played.